So good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, The Price of War and How Do CEE Countries Manage. My name is Matthias Rumpf and I have the pleasure to moderate this session today, which is part of the OECD CEE Network event series. We will discuss today the economic consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for neighboring CEE countries. This war is, of course, above all, a human tragedy for the people in Ukraine. But the social and economic shockwaves from this war are present in the CEE region as nowhere else. Taking care of millions of refugees, coping with an energy and food price shock, and dealing with interrupted trade relations, just to name some of the biggest challenges. So many good reasons to have this discussion today, and we will do so based on the latest OECD Economic Outlook, which has been published earlier this month. The findings and implications from this report for the CEE region will be presented by Alvaro Pereira. He's the director of the Country Studies branch at the OECD Economics Department, and by Eric Fromm. He is an economist within the OECD Economics Department. We also have a very distinguished and comprehensive panel today for the follow-up discussion, which I will introduce after the presentation. As always, you will have the possibility to ask questions or leave comments in the chat, and we will do our best to address them. But now I would like to give the floor to Alvaro and Eric for their presentation.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are. It's a pleasure being here, even though the topic is a difficult one, and we know that this is a region that, as Matthias said, has suffered extensively and is suffering extensively from the consequences of war. We launched our economic outlook about a couple of weeks ago. The forecast still prevails, and I think the main conclusions, still apply very strongly. So we appreciate that the Berlin Center is organizing this very pertinent seminar. So let's go for the next slide, Eric, please. So first of all, I'll present just the general picture, and then Eric will talk more about the region, and I'll come back later on. So first of all, our outlook throughout in the past few months, we've been revising down growth quite significantly. You'll see that this graph trains, partly because we had some sectors in which there was loss of critical materials or commodities, and also in some countries we start seeing also significant labor shortages, which are also starting to put pressures on wages. So even before the war, the picture was one of rising inflation that was obviously aided by stimulus, monetary and fiscal stimulus by many countries after the pandemic. And what happened after the pandemic was also, and during the pandemic, contrary to our early expectations during the pandemic, basically people saved more because of policy support in many countries, and they used them to buy houses. So this stimulated the price of houses, but also start after the pandemic was relatively over, it's still not over, but they start demanding more, and so this also put additional pressure on prices. So when the war hits, the picture was already rising inflation, including many countries of the region. But with the war, our inflation, because of very sharp rise in energy prices, which were going up already in the past few months as well, led to a significant revision upwards of our inflation projections. I should say also that our inflation projections, which for many countries and compared to other international organizations are more pessimistic, so that means we have lower growth and we have usually also higher inflation than many of these organizations and central banks. This happens because we have incorporated the impact of the oil embargo already into our projections. So this added to the inflation projections. We don't incorporate in these projections a possible gas embargo in these figures. So, but we can come back to that in the discussion, I guess. Next slide, please. Obviously, as we all know, there is a significant, because of rising inflation in many countries hitting double digits, we have a significant cost of living crisis underway. Again, it's not only energy, but also food prices, commodities, and the China lockdowns recently also probably did not help. But basically, this is mostly food and energy prices. And the food and energy prices will affect not only vulnerable households, but it's affecting everybody, because obviously this is adding to the inflationary pressures. Last thing I would like to say before I pass it on to Eric is that basically one thing that we see country after country and month after month is that inflation is not only rising, but also broadening, which means that we are getting more and more goods in which prices are growing faster than 4 or 5%. Percentage of goods is rising, but also services. So in many countries, we start seeing that inflation is broadening to many more sectors and many more goods and services. So I think this is important to also to put things into perspective when we talk about the region. So now I'll pass it on to Eric that will talk more specific about the region. Eric, please.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so turning then to the CEEs. In December, we basically had a projection that foresaw kind of a continued recovery from in the post-COVID world. Of course, the war, if it didn't derail this outlook, it at least changed it quite remarkably. And of course, this is due to direct effects. So as Alvaro was saying, energy prices have risen, other commodity prices and food has really taken a toll on household consumption, but also spillovers to global growth. So this is reflected in particular our 2022 projections that have been revised down quite markedly. We already see signs of slower economic activity in indicators. So in industrial production, for example, since the turn of the year, we've had a slowdown. It hasn't been as marked as for consumer confidence, but there is a marked slowdown. Now you can notice in the chart that Poland is a little bit of an outlier here. Some of this outlier has to do with pre-filling of existing orders. When we look at forward-looking indicators, such as orders, we also see a slowdown also in Poland in the industrial activity. Now, consumer confidence, obviously, you can see in the chart, there's a huge drop during the crisis. So this is, of course, connected then to uncertainty, but also to the increased prices, energy, but also more broadly inflation. So when we look at our inflation forecast for the region, we can see that we actually expect all countries except for Slovenia to have double-digit inflation in 2022. I think this is quite borne out already in incoming data that we received after the projections, so this doesn't seem like a stretch. And then sometime in the second half, beginning of second half or in the mid-2022, we see inflation falling back in 2023 when some of the temporary pressures are relieved. But of course, you see that inflation is not returning to the central bank's targets. We are still above, let's say, inflation targets by central banks. Now, some of this inflation is transitory, as the people said in the beginning of 2021, relating to still bottlenecks in supply chains, energy prices that are rising. But when we look at it more in more detail, we can really see that these double-digit inflation rates in many CEE countries are really broad-based. So core inflation is very high. So this tells us it's not just temporary factors. Aggregate demand is definitely high in the region. Labor markets are tight, which I will show in a little bit. And of course, this is a little bit more concerning for policymakers. There's already been quite a lot of action especially from the central banks in the region to stave off these inflationary pressures. The tightening cycle that has been extremely fast by historical standards started in mid-2021 and really took off at the end of 2021, and it's really accelerated since. So just as examples, the Hungarian National Bank raised interest rates by 185 basis points yesterday. The Czech National Bank raised by 125 basis points the week before. So there is a lot of movement with the central banks to stave off these inflationary pressures and ensure that inflation in the medium run returns to within its targets. And of course, it's important here for the central banks to anchor inflation expectations of the public at or close to its target ranges, to not get a self-fulfilling wage price spiral. The labor markets continue to be tight. They have been tight for a long period. Unemployment rates in many countries are at or close to historical lows, but this has persisted since before the COVID crisis. And we can also see that in other types of indicators. So in the right-hand side, you see the labor market tightness measure, which is vacancies over unemployment. We see that really took off in the previous recovery before COVID. Then tightness declined during COVID, and now it's back up again. And labor shortages have actually been exacerbated by the war, because for many of these countries, Ukrainians worked as temporary migrants and filled positions in agriculture, construction, and industry. And of course, many of these workers are not available anymore because they're fighting a war in the Ukraine. But the CEEs have done a lot to accommodate the Ukrainian refugees. They have welcomed many of them and take a large share of the burden. This is the credit of the governments, but also good efforts by the EU to ensure that people can come into the EU and also to stay. But also it's important to note that the existing Ukrainian diaspora in these countries help the adaptation process. On the fiscal side, there has been a deterioration in both the medium and long term in terms of fiscal sustainability. So this was actually before the war. Of course, the war has raised the investment or public spending needs on, for example, defense. That was not there before. So this really puts the CEEs in a little bit of a difficult situation, and a need to really reassess the public spending and to think about how to ensure that these medium to long-term sustainability risks doesn't materialize. So there's major policy challenges, obviously. I think uncertainty is definitely high on the list. This relates to many different things in the economy going on right now. We have the war. We do not know how long it will continue. There's also the uncertainty about what the sanctions will mean for Russia, but also what counter sanctions might mean for the rest of Europe. There's uncertainty about inflation expectations and how wages will develop in the coming year in response to the high inflation rates. And of course, COVID-19 is still around. Another great challenge is the slowing growth and rising inflation. And of course, the people that are most exposed to these dual risks, if you will, are low-income households, because they're more susceptible to changes in economic activity and suffer more when activity slows. And they also perceive inflation rates to be higher than high-income households. The high energy prices and the current risk to the energy supply is extra difficult in the CEE, both on the basis of the industrial structure, focus on manufacturing and base industry, but also in general, the lower energy efficiency in the region and also fossil fuel dependency. The refugee inflows, this creates a challenge for the public finances, but also it's a challenge for labor markets, how to integrate refugees and allow those who want to work to be able to do that and get them into the labor force. And as I said on the previous slide, there's new public spending needs. There needs to be cognizance about the sustainability about public finances in the long term. So what are then the key policy recommendations? Well, monetary policy should continue to be tight in the region. We see that aggregate demand is strong. Inflation is still very high. So monetary policy should continue to remain tight and ensure that inflation expectations are well anchored. And of course, to bring down inflation in the medium run within the targets. In terms of fiscal policy, we think that there is a cost of living crisis for many people. But here we favor targeted measurements instead of those that have been, let's say, broad-based. The broad-based measures that, for example, lower the price of energy, distort the market signals and mess up a little bit the adjustment among households and firms to higher energy prices in terms of energy efficiency and so forth. Policy can also help refugees to integrate in the local labor markets. There are some good examples of this in terms of providing childcare. Since we know that the refugees are mainly women, many of them are mothers. So helping out with childcare can really help many mothers integrate into the labor market. But language is also, as an immigrant, it's very important to learn the language. So of course, language classes would help to integrate more thoroughly. And again, in terms of fiscal policy, the plans should be credible in let's say, the medium run for consolidation. There should also be more efforts to rein in public spending increases, mainly related to aging. On the climate and the environment, we think that the current crisis really accelerates the transition, or should accelerate the green transition. Countries should continue to diversify their energy supplies. Increased energy savings is important, particularly in the CEEs. And there are available EU funds to take on these projects. So that is something that could be done. In terms of structure policy, reforms should continue to improve the business environment, cutting red tape, for example. So many of these environmental and green investments can take place more quickly. And also, of course, to bring more people into the labor market, some of which are older and some of which are mothers and so forth, to expand the labor supply and more in the medium term, resolve some of the tightness in the labor market. Thank you very much.
I just may add, Matthias, something that I think is important. So Eric already highlighted, I think, everything, but just two things. First of all, on inflation being temporary, remember, our forecasts show that yes, inflation will peak, but it will stay high, right? So we'll stay, as Eric highlighted very well, will stay higher than the target, but also very likely that the labor constraints that we see, and Eric highlighted, will likely put pressures or additional pressures on wages. So it's very possible that in many countries, wage growth will be stronger than initially expected. And obviously with high inflation, in order to avoid the so-called cost of living crisis, it's very possible that wage negotiation will result in higher wage growth than initially we expected. So it's very possible that the inflation will linger for longer than we had anticipated, for sure. Secondly, as Eric highlighted, the issue for many countries of the region in terms of fiscal sustainability is more a long-term issue than a short-term issue, right? So it's what Eric mentioned, the aging issue. Aging is good because basically we're all getting longer lives and living better lives, but we know that this, until we have a new model or something like that, there's a transition stage in which the aging costs will be significant. And in many countries, pension costs and aging costs and health costs are going to rise quite significantly. So this puts basically a lot of pressures on long-term fiscal sustainability for the countries. I think that's important to say. On the other hand, the inflation, of course, in the short run will help a little bit on that GDP ratio, because nominal GDP will be very strong. But as the interest rates will rise, and they are rising strongly, then obviously in the medium term, this will not happen. Last thing I would like to say is regarding the green transition, because this is a touchy issue for many countries of the region. What I think this crisis has shown is that the green transition, as Eric mentioned very clearly, green transition is a question of energy security. So in the short run, it's very possible that we'll see countries, in order to cope with the demand pressure in the short run, very possible that some of them will resort to coal or more oil or other carbon emitters, but very likely in the medium to long run, help also with the EU funds. The green transition will be done in a much stronger way than had been planned for the region. And this is what we are assuming, and we think that this will go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvaro and Eric, for this very comprehensive overview. And I now have the pleasure to introduce our panel for the discussion. We are joined by Łukasz Czarnecki from he's the chief economist at the Polish Ministry of Finance, and he's joining us from Warsaw. Hello, Łukasz. There's Daniel Dujawa. He's a senior economist at the Institute of Financial Policy, which I think is part of the finance ministry in Bratislava, in the Slovak Republic. Then we have Jakub Mateju. He's advisor to the board at the Czech National Bank, and he's joining us from Prague. Hello, Jakub. We're also joined by Alexander Plekanov. He's a director for transition impact and global economics at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London. He's joining us from London. Hello, Alexander. And last but not least, Uldis Rutkastev. He's the head of the monetary policy department at the Bank of Latvia, and he's joining us from Riga. So maybe we can start off the discussion with getting your insights, and there I'm looking at our panelists from the countries, from the region, on getting your comments, your thoughts on the one on the numbers, but secondly also on the underlying reasons, underlying issues. And I mean, particularly, I'm interested in your views regarding inflation. Do you share the view that this is sort of the basic drivers behind inflation, as Eric and Alvaro have cited, or are there maybe also some more local factors which had a role which might be underrepresented? I think I also find it striking if I look at the range of inflation data in the euro area, that we have 16% in the Baltics and 5% in France and Malta. So this is really a real gap, and maybe we can shed some light on this. Maybe Uldis, you would like to start, because you're coming from one of the countries which is most affected by the inflation.
Yes, at the top of the list. And thanks for inviting and to bring the Baltic experience to this discussion. So Baltic states have really high inflation at the moment, and as I mentioned, at the top in the euro area and the European Union as a whole. If you look at the components that are driving inflation, there's still food and energy. And of course, core inflation is also higher than in the euro area on average. But still, food and energy prices are way, or increase in food and energy prices way higher than in the euro area. And it appears that it's not only driven by the structure of the consumer basket, as we have kind of food and energy constitutes larger share of our consumer basket than on average in Europe. But it appears also that the prices themselves have increased much faster than in the rest of the Europe. And it appears that there is something with the energy and food price transmission. And I can think of two factors contributing to that. One is probably contract structure, how the energy prices pass on to your heating and your electricity bills. And in our case, it appears the terms of the contracts are quite flexible. So part of the population have chosen to pay, for example, market prices as regards electricity, or gas prices are administratively regulated, but generally they are linked to the market prices and pass on once in 6 months for individual consumers who have gas boilers at home, and for district heating it depends when the service provider or the heating service provider deems that costs have increased, then it has to raise the tariffs. It just submits to the regulator under the standard procedure, and they just accept, just check if it's the suggested tariff increase corresponds to the increase of the market price of energy. And also, for example, in electricity, for those who have fixed tariffs, it appears that they have kind of clauses in their agreements that allow to change even those fixed tariffs. And as I remember, for example, throughout the past 6 months of the last year, I think even fixed electricity tariffs have been changed even several times. So it appears that the pass-through is somewhat quicker than in other countries. Another kind of factor that can explain is probably different government support measures. We've had some measures in the beginning of this year, but they were kind of mostly like a kind of social support measures or lump sum transfers to some vulnerable parts of population, and also some reduction in electricity and heating tariffs, basically like transmission fees of the electricity have been removed temporarily for a couple of months, and some ceilings set on the heating and gas prices also for the first couple of months of the year. But it appears that in some other countries there are tax measures which have significant effects, and probably other measures, and there might be significant differences that also show up in inflation numbers. So that's from my side. Thanks.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you. And also seeing sort of the difference in the pass-through, but also, I mean, what we also should be aware of, that the difference in numbers, if you are reducing taxes, you see them in the inflation rate. If you're doing what the OECD is recommending, have means-tested support, you will probably not see it in the inflation rate. But taking this to Daniel, also another representative from a euro area country, if I say so, is it the same picture for you, or are there maybe other factors which are playing a role? And also, maybe taking the question a little bit further, if you look at the situation in sort of in the euro area, what are the policy options you think would be best to deal with the difference and the higher inflation in the region from your perspective?
Well, I should probably start by saying that over the last weeks we have been putting together our macroeconomic forecast, which will be published tomorrow. We expect inflation to be close to 11-12% this year, which is very close to estimates of other forecasting institutions. And of course, the pattern is very similar to what Uldis has been explaining. So much of the inflation is caused by rising prices of food and energy. It has to be mentioned that in Slovakia, maximum prices for electricity and gas are determined by a regulatory office, and those are based on average of daily futures for relevant year. Therefore, households in Slovakia so far have been sheltered from high energy prices on spot markets. Without any policy action, we estimate that the effect would take place in upcoming years. And for example, current prices of gas futures indicate that gas prices for households should increase by 130% next year, which is a huge increase. However, a Slovak government has signed a memorandum with energy providers. A memorandum with Slovenské elektrárne, which is a major electricity producer in Slovakia, has been signed, guaranteeing that prices of electricity for Slovak households will be fixed for 2023 and for 2024. It's not clear what will happen in 2025, but for the next 2 years, Slovak households will not, experience increase in electricity prices. Also, last week, Slovak Minister of Economy Richard Sulik announced a scheme which should reduce price increases of gas for households. So no increase by over 100% should happen, and the gas for households should increase by 30 to 60%. Taking this into account, we estimate that inflation in 2023 should be close to 8 or 9%. Of course, there are some factors specific to Slovak Republic, but they contribute 1 or 0.5 percentage points to overall inflation, which is currently rather negligible. For example, taxation of cigarettes is regularly increased. Also, in Slovakia, free meals for children has been provided in schools until 2021. This has been cancelled, so this contributes a little to overall inflation. But compared to what energies are doing, this is really rather negligible. We also see a broadening of inflation. We see the pass-through is happening into final prices. Also, I should probably mention that input prices are increasing much more rapidly than prices of consumer goods or prices of exports. So this is putting a rather huge pressure or profits and as well on wages. Apart from the memorandum with electricity producers and this new scheme for gas prices for households, now targeted measures have been adopted. However, last week, Slovak Parliament adopted a package of family support totaling approximately €1 billion each year. Much of this is structural expenditure consisting of child benefits, tax credit, and vouchers for extracurricular activities for children. This should not be think about as a solely anti-inflation measure, because increasing family support has been a part of government program of the current coalition for the rather protracted period. But since families in lower parts of income distribution tend to have more children, this support will be oriented towards those people which are more threatened by rising prices. However, since this is mainly since tax credit is linked to employment status, this does not cover people who are without jobs, and as well does not cover people who are without children. So this is why other institutions, for example, Council for Budgetary Responsibility in Slovakia, recommends more targeted measures, which is in line with what most other international institutions recommend. To your question that what measures we consider appropriate, well, I will just reiterate that targeted measures are what the government should be trying to do. Maybe something different is also trying to support investment that will increase potential product, reduce and dependency on imports of gas from Russia and on fossil fuels in general. But this is a long run measure, and in the short run, once again, targeted measures are the way to go. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Maybe just a quick follow-up. Are you also looking at wage moderation, like we have seen, like people are trying in Germany with this concerted action, which has been going back to the, I think, 1970s? Is this something that would be on the agenda as well, or is this?
Well, it is not on the agenda in Slovak Republic. We do not believe that currently, wage price spiral is something that threatens Slovak economy, even though as Eric explained, labor market is rather tight in Slovak Republic as well. We see a number of vacancies close to pre-COVID levels. Also, talks with major, big employers in Slovakia indicate that they have trouble hiring and finding qualified workers. We see that refugees from Ukraine are rather successful in finding jobs. Over 8,000 people have already found jobs. But despite this, we do not see wages increasing keeping pace with inflation. We expect that real wages will drop, mainly due to the pressures on costs due to high input prices. So currently, wage price spiral, I don't think that it is something that we should worry about, and mainly, due to this fact, no such thing as some kind of coordinated action is going to happen in Slovakia. But of course, once situation changes and wage price spiral will be something that we should worry about. This is probably something that should happen, because I think it's useful to think about this wage price spiral as some kind of prisoner's dilemma, when employers trying to cushion increasing costs by putting prices higher, and employees are trying to cushion higher prices by asking for higher wages. So switching to some kind of coordination games should naturally improve outcome.
Thanks very much, Daniel. So now moving outside the euro area, and I would like to turn to Jakub. You have all the instruments at your disposal you can use to fight inflation, to still boost growth, and to cope with the crisis. And you're using at least the monetary side. So what is your assessment, and what is on the table in the Czech Republic to deal with the situation?
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. First of all, I'm speaking here from my own analytical views, not necessarily overlapping with the view of the bank. But back to your question, what we are facing now is something we call a perfect inflation storm. It's really like all things coming together. The backdrop was the COVID crisis, where we even back then we had like record low unemployment, very tight labor market. During the COVID crisis, the government programs all around CEE and even broader in Europe were very successful in cushioning the blow to incomes of households. So this is also the case of the Czech Republic. So the demand of households was kept high, while the supply side was still disrupted by closures. So this mismatch of supply and demand really is the backdrop which is leading us where we are, which means a very high inflation environment, very high demand pressures on inflation, not only supply pressures, but also demand pressures. As Eric was showing in the presentation, the Czech Republic has had the highest contribution of core inflation to the current inflation numbers, which the current inflation numbers are very high, 16% of annual growth rate. I would say it's horrible, but we expect such numbers coming also in the next 2 months. Then we see the CPI year-on-year growth rates to slowly ease off due to the base effects, because the last year in late summer we had the first pro-inflationary shocks coming from the energy prices. So when this dissipates, we also have a slowing down of inflation numbers, which is actually important, the headline number, because what we are facing now is actually first signs of risks of the anchoring of inflation expectations. We have 1 year expectations of financial market analysts at 6%, which is a forecast for next year. No, it's not really these long-term expectations, but the long-term expectations on 3 years we have at 2.5, which is above our target. It's not a nice number to have. So we have still the work to do to persuade the public, the financial analysts, that the central bank is able and is willing to do whatever it takes to actually bring inflation back to the target. So really the inflation expectations is something which is very important, what we are looking at very closely. And if you also take a look at the interest rate decisions, they have the interest rate decisions have ensured that the real interest rate for the next 12 months is also always positive, like the nominal interest rate minus the 1 year inflation expectations. So this is what we are doing. There is also this second stream of tools which the central bank can use. These are like balance sheet policies, and which in the case of open market economies such as Czech Republic, it relates to the exchange rate. So we have quite huge exchange rate or FX reserves, which were accumulated in previous years when we were fighting disinflationary pressures. So at this point, when the inflation is so high above target, the board has decided to use the FX reserves to actually limit excessive depreciation of Czech koruna, which would not help in containing inflation and inflation expectations. Thank you.
Thanks, Jakub. I know you will not comment on the policy of the government, but still, since I've seen this in Eric's presentation regarding the number of refugees you welcomed in the Czech Republic as a proportion of the population, what impact on the labor market do you see from this inflow? Is there also, I mean, people, of course, they want to stay, most people don't want to stay, will want to go back once the war is over, hopefully soon. But is there any sign or any idea where you see that this might have also a positive impact on the labor market and on the tight labor market in the Czech Republic?
Yeah, we were a little bit surprised from the first numbers, because in our May forecast we have been forecasting unemployment to slightly go up because of the refugees signing in the labor offices and starting looking for jobs. But the unemployment actually went down in May, further down, like contrary to our forecast. And it seems that most of the refugees did not even go to the labor offices. They were able to directly go to the companies and find jobs directly. Some of them started returning. So this was a little bit puzzling at the first sight, but we are not actually seeing like rising unemployment due to refugees. We see rising like acceleration of people being employed, which that means that some of the refugees actually enter the labor force, start being employed, but do not contribute to higher unemployment. So this is what we are seeing now.
Okay. Thank you. And also in the chat, we had a short discussion or a longer remark regarding, where's all this coming from? I mean, I think it's clear for all of us that that the consequences we are discussing today is from the Russian aggression in Ukraine. I think I want to make this clear again, also for all the public. Now, last but not least, Lukasz, from Polish perspective, in terms of total numbers, you're sort of bearing the biggest burden from the crisis, and you also have this long border with Ukraine, so very much directly involved. Also, your assessment regarding sort of the current situation, the inflation rate, the growth perspective is sort of, what are the instruments you're using to cope with this?
Mm-hmm. Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation, and hello from I was asked by the colleagues from our international cooperation department to prepare the presentation. So if you don't mind, I would like to share 4 slides with you, not the whole presentation. Is it okay for you, Matthias?
It's okay.
All right.
Yeah. By the way, we will have until for our dear audience, we will have until 3:45. So if you want to bear with us for another 15 minutes,
no. It's just
appreciate it. But Lucas, please go ahead.
All right. Because I think you can you
small.
see? Can you see? Oh.
Yeah. Barely. Maybe you can change to presentation mode. Now it's better. Yes.
It's better. Oh, all right. So basically, just to provide you with some numbers that what you already said. I mean, inflation is everywhere. The main drivers are the energy and food prices. But for the CEE area, but especially for Poland, is the core inflation much more important. But to understand the differences between CEE countries and the rest of EU, you have to bear in mind that there are some slightly differences in the structure of the consumer price index. For example, in the case of Poland, the food and energy amounts to, let's say, 2/3 of 1/3 of the inflation basket, but only in the case of an Euro area country, it's 26%. So the food and energy prices translate more and more into inflation than in the case of Poland, and probably in the case of other CEE countries than in the case of a normal, let's say, Western Euro area country. That has already been stressed in the presentation. The energy intensity of the Polish industry or the industry of other CEE countries is much higher than in case of other countries. Basically, you can divide this slide into 2 parts. On the right side, you get a CEE region with Malta. But on the left side, you get all the other countries in the EU. So basically, for example, when you compare Germany to Poland, so the 1% of GDP in Germany need half that energy that is needed, for example, in Poland. To core inflation, this is an important part of the story. But basically, the core inflation has been slightly higher in Poland, also in the pre-COVID period, mainly due to the spike in services, in the services prices. Then it stayed on the elevated level for 3, 4, or 5 quarters, mainly due to the tight labor market and mainly to the quick rebound in the Polish economy. And then you see the spike from the second part of the last year. It is basically, in my opinion, all the higher energy prices were translated into higher prices also in the core inflation. You asked me also about anti-inflationary measures. So we have 2 huge packages, I would say. The first one is the so-called anti-inflation shield. It's mainly lowering the taxes, including VAT taxes, excise tax on energy, food, fuel, and so on and so on. So you see the rates here. And the other part of that is our direct transfers to the households with lower income. And this is basically what has been provided by the government within the last couple of months. We have calculated, we tried to estimate what's the impact on CPI, and it's about 3 percentage points when you assume that the anti-inflationary shield will be valid until the end of the year, because the government announced it until the end of July. It has been prolonged recently until the end of October, and now probably it's going to be to phase out in the next year. And another very important anti-inflationary measure are the so-called credit holidays. The problem of Polish sector is, and it's let's say in an extraordinary situation also for the CEE countries, we have a lot of more than 90% of mortgages are set in the variable interest rates. So the interest rates hikes translate into higher installment payments. So basically, when you see the data, there was a rise from on average from 25% up to 50% of the disposable income in some of the cases. So that's why the government decided to introduce this credit holidays, and it allows people to switch 8 installment payments within the next 16 or 17 months. So it is very important from especially from the Polish perspective. And you, Matthias, also asked me about, this is the last slide. You asked me about the labor market and the costs and the integration of refugees in the Polish society. So basically, it is really, I think it's really a huge success because the Polish-Ukrainian border was crossed by more than 3 billion of Ukrainians. Some of them went farther to Germany, to other EU countries. Some of them went back, but when you look at the data from the Polish PESEL system, it's the Polish ID system, because all the Ukrainians who came to Poland could get access to healthcare system, to the labor market by getting this PESEL number. So we have 1.2 billion refugees already registered in the Polish system. Mainly there are women and children, and from this 1.2 people, 260 kilo are already working, are in the labor market. I think it's a great success, and it can be also a huge positive impulse for the Polish economy, taking into account what has been said during the presentation, with all the aging problems that Poland and also other CEE countries are facing. Okay, thank you very much.
Perfect, thank you, Lucas. Before we turn to the green part, where I would, start off with Alexander, I would like to give either Eric or Alvaro maybe the possibility to respond, because we have seen, I think, a couple of very interesting factors which are also very relevant in the assessment of the situation, starting from the transmission from energy prices to consumers, to the balance between tax and price compression and support, and also what Jakob mentioned, that sometimes you have to get the numbers down for inflation, and this is only done, if you have anything with the prices to the end, that the good story, the interesting story about the labor market in Poland. So maybe a quick response to you before we go to our last topic, and then I would like to give Alexander the floor.
Well, I can start, perhaps Eric can add. Well, certainly this is what I was saying. Basically, the pressures were there before the war, right? So you could see some of the graphs then, in fact, that we just saw from Lucas as well, that all this rising inflation and rising basically wage pressures and labor pressures were happening before the war. The war just exacerbated the problem. And this was not only in Eastern Europe, there was also happening in many Baltic countries, and it was happening all across Europe. It was starting to happen, and other parts of the world too. So first, there is this pressure that was happening already. That was adding. I would be very interested, perhaps, to hear from the panel about what do they expect for wages, because I think this is something, well, some of you mentioned this issue, but this is quite important. And I was yesterday just in Luxembourg, where there is more a centralized approach. But right now, I think we all want to learn from each other what's going on in terms of wages. So it'll be interesting to know. But secondly, again, the labor pressures. The labor shortages were very acute in many countries. Unemployment is at historical low in many countries, continues to be, as we just heard. And in fact, it continues to go down rather than going up right now. And this will only add to the pressures. Some sectors have extreme labor shortages. Some companies cannot find workers, or at least they find it very difficult to find workers in terms of construction, in terms of IT, and a few other sectors that this is happening. So this was happening before, and the war definitely added to the pressures by increasing energy prices and food prices. So now we have producer prices rising at really at a very high level that we haven't seen for many, many years, and which will put additional pressures on CPI inflation as well. But perhaps Eric wants to add something very.
Yes, thank you. No, I agree with Alvaro, and I think the wage price spiral risk is a very difficult one, because of course we cannot observe the wage spiral starting unless it's too late, because then we see wages rising and inflation is picking up. So at least from my point of view, this is quite the risk, and I'm worried about this because of these existing pressures that was there before the war that Alvaro mentioned, and that we carried it all along into this new situation where we now have additional factors. And of course, for households and workers, it's very hard to distinguish core inflation from headline inflation. For them, this is inflation and this is biting in. So of course, many people want to get compensated. So I'm also very interested in hearing how you assess these wage price spirals and what kind of view you have on this, and also on the upcoming wage negotiations. Thank you.
I don't know. Thank you, Eric and Alvaro. This would be another topic, but I think I would like to go really to the green part now, as this is also important, if you don't mind, and really bring in Alexander. Yeah, you've been waiting so long, and I think you're the right person to ask about sort of what are the implications for the green transition, which of course is a medium-term project, but how. The question is, of course, how the sudden spike in energy prices, but also the different environment in financing a transition. How do you think this has affected the perspective of, getting this or keeping this on track, or maybe even, I don't know, accelerating, putting the brake on? Or what is your assessment on the impact of the current situation on the green transition?
It's a great question, and I think it's much more complex than people believed maybe even a few months ago. There are a number of opposing forces. I think that on the one hand, there is a very strong shock to Europe that supply of gas, that is the cornerstone of industry, residential heating, and many other things, suddenly cannot be taken for granted. And that's an opportunity to move greener. On the other hand, the shock to energy prices induces a response in terms of subsidies and so on to keep prices low, but also induces the governments to take old coal plants back into production. And that's probably not what people expected might happen even a year ago. So I think policy response at this juncture is crucial. And even if we take response to high food and energy prices, we see a variety of policies, in fact, very many across economies where we work. And I think that some of these policy response is constructive. Some of this policy response may well make the problem worse, markets more fragmented. We certainly see that. If we look at food prices, today the price shock is probably comparable to 2008 so far, but the number of calories subject to export restrictions and similar bans is about 70% higher. So governments responded much more strongly by trying to isolate the national markets and introduce export restrictions. Similar with fuel, we see price subsidies per unit of consumption. We see essentially rationing, price controls in certain economies. I think in Hungary now one can get 15 liters of petrol at a time at the petrol station, and so on. So I think if we look at these subsidies, more or less, there are four objectives. That what makes it so complex. But one of the important objectives is to try to keep the marginal consumption incentives unaffected as much as possible, so that at the margin, residents and industry faces high energy prices, because that's what ultimately drives technological solutions and green transition. There were a lot of comments on the chat, by the way, to that extent. And the other is, of course, that the subsidies need to help those who need help, and lower income households do experience higher inflation and higher energy inflation, as panelists here highlighted. But also it needs to be done at a reasonable fiscal cost overall. And these are the charts that we started with, that Eric and Alvaro showed, that the fiscal situation is increasingly a cause of concern. And also, very importantly, communication has to be effective. People need to see that what is proposed addresses their needs, a little bit like with Donald Trump policies: migrants are coming, build the wall. That kind of simple message that people understand. And I think here, what, for example, some of the solutions that were now being rolled out here in the UK, but also parts of them in Poland, may tick many of these boxes. For example, taking a set subsidy per household and subtracting it from an annual energy bill, so that annual energy companies bill back the treasuries. That doesn't actually change the prices paid by consumers at the margin, but it does help poorer households more than richer households, because for them it is a higher proportion of consumption. It keeps overall cost in check, and it also is taken off the energy bill. So people actually see that this particular amount of money that they receive is directly connected to the energy problem. So maybe this is a greener way of addressing affordability concerns and the energy transition, and at the same time still keeping incentives for the green transition in place. I will probably stop here. I've been talking for a while, and happy to hear reactions.
Thanks, Alexander, and thanks also for putting sort of this medium-term perspective and the complexity of it into the discussion, and having sort of this sort of medium-term strategy, but at the same time, facing the current problem with the inflation is very important. Maybe, I don't know, who of you would like to respond and maybe share the perspective also from your countries. Uldis, you would like to, maybe also with a twist in the political economy around these measures, because I think that's also quite important. Economically, they might be sound and good, but are they also well understood by the consumers and by the public? Will they accept it as sort of the economic sound solution that also works for them?
Yes, thanks. And I completely agree to what Alexander mentioned about keeping incentives right. And we have a good example of the dynamics, in the dynamics how the support was provided and is expected to be provided in the autumn of the next heating season. So in the first, basically last months of the last year and first months of this year, basically the last heating season, as I mentioned, government provided kind of twofold support, like lump sum payments to pensioners and families with kids, and basically put caps on prices of gas and district heating, and also kind of reduced electricity price by kind of temporarily abandoning this transmission fees. And basically that provided a cap on your heating, your energy bills effectively. So what they're looking forward for the next season, and we as a central bank also played a role in providing advice to the governments to make this support more targeted and basically to think about incentives they provide. And recently government has more or less agreed on the schemes of the support schemes for the next heating season. And what they're going to do, they're going to kind of fix last heating tariffs as a base, and then on top of that, if the current tariffs raise about that, government is going to compensate half of the increase, and half of the increase would be kind of on the burdens of the population. And in our minds, basically, this is kind of a more targeted support, and this provides better incentives than price caps we experienced in the past. And also regarding social support, I think the overall interplay between, supply demand factors and what to do in the obstacles when demand is probably high, but you have also these massive social problems. There is nothing new as 3T strategy, like timely, targeted, and temporary support. And in our case, also regarding the social part of social leg of the support was made more targeted. From these lump sum transfers to broad groups of the population, as pensioners or families with kids, towards kind of more targeted means-tested supports. They now kind of broaden the base of the population that would kind of be able to apply for the housing benefits to help cover partly their heating and energy bills if their income per capita are low. So basically, they're going to make it more targeted, means-tested support, and then of course some lump sum payments would also remain in this autumn's package, but also will be more targeted. Basically, the lump sum transfers to pensioners, but up to the certain level of the pension. If your pension is low, you get more of this lump sum payments, and if your pension is high, you don't get support. So I think that's the way forward, and I'm happy that in Latvia we managed to make this support more targeted and to make also kind of incentives better than we had previously. Thanks.
Thanks for this. I don't know, Lukas, Daniel, Jakub, any remarks from your side? Any experience you would like to share on managing this very difficult process of giving support on the energy side, but without taking away the incentive for reducing energy consumption? Anything you would like to share from your side? Also from maybe the political dynamic would also be really interesting to have. If you would like to come in, please. Yeah, Jakub, please.
Yeah, I can share a few thoughts, because you are very right about the political dimension that actually economically it makes a lot of sense. When we have high energy prices now, then the alternative renewables now suddenly become competitive and don't need to be subsidized maybe that much, because they by themselves they are a little bit more competitive to the higher prices which we anyway have. So this could be an opportunity to actually accelerate the green transition. But on the other hand, there are also costs of the high inflation environment, for example, in the form of like higher interest rates, which make green investments more costly, and also the political dimension that people actually start caring more about surviving over the heating season rather than, and the green target might become like secondary for the next few months or even next year. So this is clearly an issue which is not easy to navigate. Maybe we, as an economist, we can explain that this is an opportunity to actually go away from the fossil fuels and invest a little bit more in the renewables, which are becoming more competitive when the costs are rising.
So not only communication matters in terms of anchoring in inflation, but also for managing a good green transition. Lukas, Daniel, any further thoughts to this topic? If not, or Eric, if you would like to.
I can just add a few comments, because you probably know that Slovakia is one of the most dependent country on Russian gas, And the most important reason is that apart from being used a little bit in about 15% of gas imports are used in the chemical industry, but the majority used for heating purposes. So in Slovakia, renovation of buildings, changing of heating boilers and measures like that are going to be crucial in upcoming years. But as already mentioned, this is a medium-term project at best. But this is something that has been already discussed before the war, and rather large sum of money from recovery and resilience plan are to be dedicated to this purpose. So we believe that those money will be used wisely, and current situation will only motivate people more to do such renovation and increase energy efficiency of buildings.
If I may just add one thing, I was with a presentation 2 or 3 years ago in Berlin, and basically I think that there won't be any successful energy transition if we don't take into account that there are some households, and I presented the data for Poland. I don't know how it looks in other CEE countries, but 2 or 3 years ago, I remember in the chart I showed the data. There are some households in Poland that spend 20-25% of their disposable income on energy. So there is a huge misunderstanding what is going on, for example, in some part of Poland, and then when you compare that with Germany, France, and so on. So Poland has successfully incorporated the energy transition into the RRF. So there is a huge incentive, positive impulse where I see it on Polish energy transition, but still, I mean, also in terms of political economy, we have to really take into account that some of the households spent much more money on relatively much more money on their energy than the other countries of the EU.
Thanks, Lukasz, also for this insight. Also tells us that maybe even on the consumption basket for inflation, we might have to, take a look at the spread within the countries, and in particular in Central and Eastern Europe, the spread is probably rather large than much larger than you would see in Western European countries. So also this is a very important point. We're now coming kind of to the end of our slightly extended session. Leaves me with thanking you all for the very insightful, engaged discussion, as I can see here in the chat as well. I hope our audience does agree with this. I really learned a lot, and I found it very insightful. So thanks again for your time. Alvaro had to leave earlier, unfortunately, but also thanking him. As I said at the beginning, this is one event in the OECD CEE network, so there will be more events to come, and I hope to see all of you either as panelists or as participants very soon in one of these events. So thanks again from my side to all of you for the good discussion, and for the audience for their interest, and hope to see you soon, and hopefully also with a slightly more positive environment as well. So let's see, let's hope for the best. Thanks very much.
Thank you
very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.